Hey there, Merritt here. Happy unusual summer of 2020. I am taking a break from producing new episodes this summer because I'm spending these months investing in my new mastermind group and working on 2 projects just for you that I haven't had time to finish before now, but I cannot wait to share them with you. The first is an audiobook roadmap of the spiritual journey of launching a God-shaped dream, and the other is my imposter syndrome curriculum intended to help you get past this very tough roadblock in your dreaming. So instead of new episodes, I'm re-releasing some of my favorite episodes from my first 5 seasons of the podcast. They're the ones that I loved, but maybe you missed, and I hope you enjoy them. And I have 2 tools just for you to help support your movement toward a God-shaped dream this summer. Number 1, I have compiled journaling questions for each of these episodes that will help you process your dream. And I want to challenge you, even though it's summer, even though it's still kind of a pandemic, that there's some deep internal work we can all benefit from before we're able to make real progress toward our dream. So go grab the journal packet in my store at merrittonsa.com/store. It's just $5 and it'll help you go deeper as you consider and begin to take the next steps in your dream. Then number 2, come find me and other dreamers inside the Devoted Dreamers Insiders group on Facebook. I'll be hanging out there at least once a week, and we can chat about whatever you're struggling with, the spiritual battles we face as Christians and dreamers, and how you can move forward despite it all. All right, thanks for being here, and now here is your episode for this week. You're listening to episode 23 of Momentum, Pursuing What Matters Most, the podcast about taking initiative in life and work, following God's lead, and paying attention to what happens next. I'm your host, Merritt Onsa, and my desire is to help you find the permission, space, and courage you need to pursue your God-shaped dreams. And that starts with introducing you every week on the podcast to courageous women who are creatively pursuing their God-given gifts in beautifully imperfect ways, one day at a time. This weekly podcast is intended to inspire and encourage you and point you to the giver of good dreams, God Himself. And this week I'm introducing you to a guest who I think will challenge how you think about your God-shaped dreams. Hannah Anderson lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and she is the author of 2 practical theology books. The first is called Made for More, and then there's the newly released Humble Roots, How Humility Grounds and Nourishes Your Soul, and that's available through Moody Publishers. You can find more of Hannah's writing at sometimesalight.com. You can listen to her on her weekly podcast called Persuasion, or follow her on Twitter at sometimesalight. In fact, that Persuasion podcast mentioned in Hannah's bio is where I met her for the first time. My friend Erin Straza, who was a Momentum guest all the way back in episode 1, she and Hannah co-host Persuasion, and in January of this year, they invited me to be a guest. I'll be honest, I was super nervous to do my first ever podcast interview with them, but it was such a positive experience for me and very challenging in a good way. And Hannah and Erin were great co-hosts. I loved being with them and getting to discuss some topics with them. But I do think it was one of kind of the not so gentle pushes out of my comfort zone that eventually led me to consider and start the Momentum podcast. So big thanks to Hannah and Erin for the excellent experience of joining you both on Persuasion. So in this episode, Hannah will be answering the questions, and she and I are talking about how she very intentionally pursued the craft of becoming a writer in an effort to steward the gifts that God has given her and to model that courage for her young daughter. She shares that just because God calls us to something, it doesn't mean we're guaranteed a specific outcome. And we talk about why we should obey His call anyway. She's honest about the challenge she personally faces, including time management and executing on her ideas. And I can relate to those for sure. And she gave me such a great reminder that our dreams are not the end goal, but following God is. I think you will gain so much from my conversation with Hannah. She has some real treasures of wisdom to share with us. You might even want to have a pen and paper ready to take notes. So without further ado, let's meet Hannah Anderson. Hello, Hannah. How are you today?
Hi, Merritt. It's so good to be with you.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm thrilled to share you with our listeners today, and I would love for you to just kick us off talking about where are you right now in your God-shaped dream?
Well, I am in a place I never thought I would be. And I know probably a lot of people will say that, but right now I find myself spending a lot of my time as a writer, as an author even, if you can gauge the nuance of that. But I never expected to be here. In fact, for most of my young adult life, I really didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. You may know people like that maybe they just bloom a little later. I always found that to be true about myself, where I had a lot of enthusiasm and joy for a lot of different things, and that just confused me. So I didn't know what to pursue. But about 6 years ago, I found myself at home with young children. My daughter was 6 at the time. I had a son who was 4 and a son who was about 18 months. And I was just wrestling with this need to steward gifting and to beginning to feel these. It wasn't that being at home and being with my children wasn't enough, but that I felt this level of kind of agency and responsibility for who I was as an individual, and maybe the giftings that God had given me. And I also saw my daughter, who, as I mentioned, was 6 at the time, growing up. She wasn't a baby anymore. She was entering 1st and 2nd grade. And I realized that my life would model for her what she understood about Christian womanhood, or about taking ownership of your gifting and calling. And so that kind of caught me up short, because I didn't want her to see a mom or a woman who made excuses for her life or was fearful about not pursuing her gifting. So that meant that I had to take ownership of it. So about 6 years ago, I started on a path toward writing. It was very small steps of faith. I started a blog just as a way to be accountable, to say, I need to do this. I need to do something. I'm not sure what it is, but I need to take those steps of faith. Gradually, that grew into, maybe I'll pitch an article to this other blog, or I'll pitch a small piece to this magazine or this online publication. And through the process, I was wrestling with God about whether that was what he was actually calling me to. And I pretty much just said to him, okay, you've got 2 years. I will commit to faithfully pursuing this craft for 2 years. And if you do something with it, that's up to you. And if you don't, at the end of 2 years, I'm done. And within 18 months of starting the blog, I had a book contract, which, if you know anything about publishing, that's pretty much outside of anybody's control. You just don't get that opportunity. And so I knew, it was very apparent to me that God was doing something bigger than anything I had any control over. And it was my responsibility to just get on board and to go with it, and to own it as what he was calling me to. And this dream began to grow. I really fell in love with writing, with expressing myself in the written word. And that began about 6 years ago. And the last several years, it's just grown in ways that I would never have expected. So I opened up by saying, I never knew that I would be here. I never expected to be here. And part of that I just love. I just love that God knew me intimately enough and crafted me intimately enough that he would be fulfilling dreams that I didn't even know to have.
Yeah. And so, I mean, this could take us off track, but I do want to ask, like, what did you do before you had kids? Like, was writing even anywhere on the spectrum of your interests, or?
I was a humanities major in university. So again, that just shows my lack of being able to pinpoint one thing I wanted to do. So I had taken a lot of literature courses, a lot of language courses. I took one writing class my entire undergrad. And it was only because I wanted to take a class with this professor. I didn't really have any interest in pursuing writing as a career, as even a hobby. And interestingly, when I first got out of college, I worked as an ESL instructor in corporate setting. I worked with companies like Michelin and BMW who would bring managers over from Europe, and they needed help just adapting to American culture, working with presentations, business letters, learning. They generally had a base understanding of English, but just putting the finishing touches on it. And what I find so fascinating on this side of things is I basically had several years of intense having to learn how the English language worked, how words functioned, what the difference between using an ing on a verb does, how it moves us internally differently than it might if you used a different tense. And so I often rely on things like that, like the linguistics that I never knew would be part of this. But now, like, I have this structural background for how language fits together that God, looking back, was putting in place. Right. Said, okay, you need that piece of the puzzle. But in terms of saying, oh, someday I want to write a book, that really wasn't part of a dream I even knew to have.
Wow. And now you've written and published too.
Yes. The first released in 2014, and it was called Made for More. And it is a practical theology of what it means to be an image bearer. What does it mean to have a life shaped after God's nature? And then earlier this month, the second book released is called Humble Roots. And it is kind of picks up the same conversation as Made for More. And it is an exploration of what it means to be human, particularly humility to embrace our human limitations, to say, we are not God, we are not transcendent, that's okay. How do we live this very good but limited life?
Wow, I need both of those, for sure. Well, talk about, Hannah, what challenges have you faced, other than having to learn what it is to be an author, but along this road that you've been on?
Well, I feel like God has been developing it outside of me in a lot of ways. And so an opportunity will come up that I didn't go after or I wasn't anticipating. And honestly, it's just been a process of growth every time a new opportunity comes up, of saying, okay, am I going to step into this even though I don't know what it is or how to do it? Am I going to take this as from God and then trust he's going to provide the structure and the people that I need to help me fulfill this? And so I look over the last 5 or 6 years of learning the craft of writing and learning the publishing industry. And there are so many steps of faith that I had to say, I don't know this, but I trust that God is leading there, and he's going to have to bring the right people to help me do this, or bring the right structure to help me do this. And so what I've discovered myself is I struggle a lot with like time management or structuring my work. And I've needed to bring friends into that. And even my husband, it's like organization is his love language. Mm-hmm. He's very good to help me have that structure in my life. And as the opportunities have grown, it's just become so significant to me to recognize that none of us are fulfilling our God-given dreams alone. They require so many other people to be brought into them. And so right now, one of the challenges I'm facing is learning how to build that team, learning that in my limitations, I may be able to write, but I'm pretty bad at invoicing. I'm pretty bad at scheduling. I'm pretty bad at getting where I need to be at the right times. And so I have to bring people, friends, loved ones, whoever I need into that to help us all together work toward this goal that's bigger than any one of us.
And so I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. Like, are these literally like you have a friend who's good at organizing and you're like, hey, can you help me organize my life? Or what does that look like?
I literally have a friend who will text me where I need to be because she knows if I'm in the middle of a project and I need to go pick up my kids, that she will have to text me to go get my kids. Wow. I mean, that's a little bit extreme, but she's local here. She's traveled with me some when I travel to speak. When I drive, she usually goes with me, not because I can't do it, but it's not natural for me to be able to handle, just the logistics of getting here and getting there. And so that drains me to a place where if I show up at an event, I'm far too exhausted just from getting there. Yeah. So she'll travel with me as she can. She'll drive. She's very, very good at, sending me emails and saying, hey, and we've reached a place as friends where it is not offensive to me to have this person who knows me well enough know that, Hannah's not going to remember this event that we're all supposed to be at. And she's not going to be offended when I just show up at her house and say, hey, it's time to go. And I mean, she'll say to me, I'll pick you up at this time. And I'll be like, okay, that's good.
What a blessing. Oh my God.
It is. And, to be honest, there is a level of growth that you just have to do, Yeah. I think it's, sometimes we can look at our limitations and we can excuse ourselves and say, well, I'm just not good at that. And there have been, different responsibilities of things like keeping records or doing the billing or doing invoicing that, at the end of the day, I just have to do. But if I have that team around me that can make it easier for me to do what I can do, and like my husband, for example, he handles all of financial kind of issues with taxes or, just checking up, hey, you submitted that article. Did you get payment for it? Because for me, I may remember to submit the invoice, but then would never actually follow up to see if I got paid. And it wouldn't even be an issue. Like I'd be on to my next project. Right. But you also can't just give your time away, especially if you have responsibilities to children or husband or the people around you. So the business side of things has been hard for me.
I think that's hard for any creative, right? Like it's the other side of the brain. Well, Hannah, I do want to ask you about, okay, so since these 2 books have been published, and obviously The Humble Roots was the most recent one, is there something next that God is revealing to you, or another dream related to your writing?
Well, it's funny because, and I assume other authors or really anybody that does project-based work, when the project releases, you kind of have this postpartum period where you're recovering from the exertion of creating this work and then releasing it into the world. And emotionally, you can sometimes just have this lull or this need for a little bit of space or distance from the work you've done. You just need to recover. And I kind of feel that a little bit now. But as I look out on this horizon, I know I definitely want to write more books like Made for More and Humble Roots. I would love to just develop a whole line of practical theology books that all have that similar structure and just delve into different aspects of our Christian walk. But I also know, if I'm brutally honest with myself, I also know that that would be a very safe place for me to stay as an author. The books have been generally well received. I've gotten into a place where I know how to write them. I mean, it took work to learn how to do that, but I'm kind of in a place where, I know how this works. I know how this type of book works. And even though I want to continue that, I do know that God is not a God of status quo. He is a God that is always calling us to venture out into the deep with him. He's calling us to steps of faith. And the process to writing Made for More and Humble Roots were both filled with many, many steps of faith. And when I reach a place of comfort, then the faith isn't as necessary. And so now as I look out on the horizon, I really have this sense of calling that God would be calling me beyond maybe this genre into maybe to exploring other genres, particularly fiction. I know that fiction has been so formative in my own life to be able to paint pictures of the truths that, when you have a nonfiction book, you're learning the structure of the truths. And when you have a fiction book, you're seeing it in real life. You're seeing it fleshed out in story form. And that terrifies me. I'm so comfortable with how nonfiction writing works that the idea of moving into this space and trusting God to be as faithful in that genre as he has been faithful over the last 5 or 6 years. I'm at the point where I'm not sure how it's going to happen, but I'm pretty much resigned that, all right, this is going to happen. And what's going to have to change between now and when it does is a whole lot of growth and a whole lot of transformation and a whole lot of soul searching on my part to have the faith to follow God out there.
What do you think is the kind of the scariest part about doing that, about going that fiction road?
For me, it is the fear of failure, not being able to do it well. The fear of being mediocre, there's also a level of fear of emotional vulnerability. When I'm writing nonfiction, even though I try to bring my life and my spiritual walk into it, and I do intentionally try to be transparent with my struggles, there's still this level of distance. There's still this, I'm operating in the world of ideas. They can be separate from me. they're like puzzle pieces that I can put together. And it's fairly safe. When I think about writing nonfiction and developing characters, I think about the level of emotional and spiritual honesty I'll have to have with myself, and exploring what makes us make the choices that we do, and how do we exhibit that in our lives. What are the little actions or dialogue or cues that reveal the human heart? And that's just a really vulnerable place to be as a writer. And I have mad props to people who can do that, who can look into the face of the human heart and not shake in their boots and then can write authentically and convincingly about the state of human existence.
Yeah, we are a complex being. For sure. Well, I look forward to seeing what God does with you in that.
And listeners, and whoever is, writing this down, you're thinking, okay, mental note, Hannah said she'd do this. You will know how my spiritual walk is going based on how long it takes me to do this. I just want you to know.
Okay, so it's 2016 right now.
You will be able to chart how much Hannah is resisting the work of the Holy Spirit in her life. Because it really does terrify me. And I know it's going to be a spiritual journey of obedience and vulnerability that, when the time is right, God will take me down that. But that's what it's going to be for me. I know it.
Well, and I've never thought about it that way. So you're giving me a lot to ponder, like just even considering what it takes to create a story. That is a complex task, I'm sure. Well, I wanted to ask too, kind of when you're in this place of like, okay, God is leading me down a path that I feel a little uncertain about or a little insecure about. I mean, is there some scripture that you have been turning to lately that has been encouraging you just to continue, just to take that next step?
Yeah. And I think what I mentioned earlier was that one of the things that's holding me back is that fear of not knowing how it turns out. And and that's across the board for anything God is calling us to. Just the uncertainty of, do I want to invest this much of myself, my emotion, my mental energy, my time into something that I'm not guaranteed a specific outcome for? And so that really is the challenge of faith that I struggle with. And as I was writing Humble Roots, one of the passages that I spent some time exploring is in Ecclesiastes Chapter 11. And the idea of this, the first part of this chapter, it starts with a somewhat famously poetic phrase of, cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. And this section of the scripture, Solomon is basically saying to the reader, you need to come to grips with your own limitation. And, we look for all the right signs before we'll embark on a project. And he's warning the reader, you can't wait for everything to be just right before you do the work, because even that is relying on your own strength to bring about certain results. And so in verse 5 and 6, just a few verses after that very poetic opening, he basically says, you don't really know how any of this thing works. I mean, let's talk about how limited you are as a human being. You do not know the way the spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child. So you do not know the work of God who makes everything. And then he follows up and he says, because you don't know this, because you don't know how God is going to work, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. And basically the call, and this really brought me up short as I was working through Humble Roots. A lot of times our fear of failure is a form of pride in our ability to control outcomes. And Solomon is saying, you don't know anything. You don't know how a baby comes alive in its mother's womb. You don't know how God makes anything. You don't know what his work is, what he's doing around you and in you. And because you don't know, you have no reason to stop working. You have no reason not to step into these things that he is calling you to. Your fear of failure or mediocrity, you can't even prove that that would happen. So, because you can't, do your work. Get up in the morning, plant your seeds. In the evening, do what you're supposed to do, because you have no idea what's going to prosper and what's not going to prosper. And that has to be left in God's hands. And all you're responsible for is the faithful obedience of working when he calls. And I find that passage in Ecclesiastes 11 to be both kind of convicting and comforting at the same time. It kind of brings you up short, but in a good way, in a way that's satisfying and relieves the pressure almost.
Yeah, I'm sitting in that tension right now. I mean, I totally feel that. Like, there's a freedom in, this is his. Like, go do your work. And then, oh, have I really been believing that? So, thank you, Hannah. That's helpful to me. And I think I'll be thinking about that for a few more days.
Yeah, and really what happened, and I'll just tell this little story, is I wrote about this passage in Humble Roots, and it kind of came clear to me through something that happened to our family a couple of summers ago. In the book, Humble Roots, each chapter is kind of based around plant imagery, based on my life here. I live in the Southwest Virginia, and we live in a rural working class community. And so we have these cultural rhythms that keep us pretty close to the earth. And for this chapter in this passage, it reminded me of something that happened about 2 or 3 years ago, where my husband had gotten a hold of some heirloom beans, like green beans, snap beans. That had been passed down in his community he grew up in. And he brought them down the mountain, and he was so excited. He was going to plant these beans, and we were going to have them in our garden, and we were going to eat these beans. And he planted them, and he tended them, and he built these bamboo teepees for them to climb. And, they grew, and we had these really lush, beautiful vines with absolutely no beans on them. I mean, they looked beautiful and nothing happened. So he was really frustrated, of course, because he had put all this time and effort into it. And that same summer, we had constructed a patio off the back of our house, and there was a pile of dirt. You know how when you're doing construction, the area around the space the grass gets, all torn up. So we had this place of dirt that we were going to seed in later, like in the fall. We were going to put grass seed on it. Well, a couple weeks after it became clear that my husband's beans were not going to produce beans, we saw these green sprouts coming up in this dirt patch, and they looked really familiar. And sure enough, after a couple of days, we realized they were bean plants. And so we started grilling the children. Okay, it's like, what's going on? Why are there beans growing next to our patio? And so my 10-year-old, he was 8 at the time, he's like, he told us he had gotten a hold of the bag of beans and was just playing with them. He was playing farmer, and he had planted a whole bunch of them, just messing around in the dirt. And sure enough, those beans grew and grew and grew and produced more beans than we could use the rest of the summer.
Wow. From just a random pile of dirt.
Just a random pile of dirt. And at first it was a little offensive. It's like, wait a minute, I put all this work in my garden and these are the beans that are going to grow. But you also have to submit yourself to what's happening. And so my husband went and got a stake. He staked them up and we picked beans the rest of the summer off of those plants. And it was just such a physical reminder that we have no idea where God's going to work. And we can invest all kinds of energy in something and it won't be successful. But we can also invest no energy in something and God can bring it to life and bring rewards. And so what we are called to do with our dreams and our passions and whatever is the work in front of us, we are called to just be faithful in obedience. I mean, I honestly believe my husband was supposed to plant bean plants that would not produce. That was his call of faithfulness. And God being sovereign over all of that, he brings forth the fruit where he brings it forth.
And my next question for you, I feel like, is almost redundant, but what advice do you have for other women in pursuing their God-shaped dreams?
For me, it just comes down to obedience. If you pursue your dream for the dream itself, you may be very disappointed. If the thing that gets you up in the morning is the thought of, I'm going to accomplish this dream, then your spiritual and emotional stability is going to be linked to how successful that dream is. And when you have a bad day and it's struggling, then you are going to struggle too. That doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to our dreams, and that doesn't mean that we don't hear the call of God in them. But what we're responding to is the call of God. And he is using the dream to fulfill a whole lot of other purposes in us. He is using the dream to bring us to greater self-awareness of how he made us and our limitations. He is using the dream to bless other people. He is using the dream to glorify himself. And so the dream, the calling is essential to that process, but the dream is not the end goal. What is the end goal is following him where he leads and hearing his voice and taking those steps of obedience and surrender to who he has made you to be and where he has placed you and the burdens he's put on you. So we absolutely have to listen to those, but they cannot become more significant to us than he is. It's the same idea of the gift cannot be more valuable to us than the giver. The dream cannot be more important than the one who gives the dream.
So true in all of the things that we long for. They have to be second place, at least second place to him. Thanks for that. I needed to hear that today. So Hannah, is there anything related to the dream that you've shared with us that if God wasn't in it, you'd be shaking in your boots?
Well, I think going back to what I mentioned earlier about expanding beyond a genre that I'm comfortable with, that terrifies me. And to this point, I've got my eye on God. I'm kind of like watching him pretty closely going, you sure about this? Is this you? Because if this is you, I will follow you. But if this isn't you, I'm not going there. So I think that the call to possibly branch out into other spaces and other forms of writing, I'm definitely wary about, but the more confidence I gain that, yes, God is the one calling to this place, then the more I'm willing to say, okay, I'll just follow you there.
And you might still be shaking.
Yes. Yeah. But I also feel like God's got a responsibility in this too, right? This is not faith without promise. And one of the things I learned when I first got started writing was I did say to him, okay, you've got 2 years, but you're going to have to prove yourself in this. It's not like we're blindly following. It's not like we're just committing ourselves to these dreams that we've convinced ourselves we're supposed to do, and we have no indication that God is in it. So as I begin even these very scary steps, I'm also pretty expectant that God's got to give some kind of indication. Yes, I'm here. Take the next step. Okay, good girl. Now take the next step. Okay, you're doing a good job. Now take the next step. And so it's not like he's standing across the room and we're a toddler, shakily trying to take our first steps toward him. In my experience, it's been more like he's 2 or 3 steps out in front of me, and I'm taking that kind of scary step, and then he moves back just a little bit, and I have to take the next one, and we're slowly together working our way across the room. So he's not out there demanding, you come to me. He's like, I'm here. Just come on with me. We'll do this together, but you're going to have to come.
And I love that picture. I mean, having a toddler, it wasn't that long ago that she took those shaky steps. And Hannah, I want to know, how do you sense God meeting you in that? Like the picture that I see is like a gentle father. Is that what you're experiencing him as?
It is gentle. It is sometimes playful. Sometimes he will, out of nowhere, bring an opportunity that I could never have created for myself. And I imagine him just getting a good chuckle out of it. A good sense of, I knew that was going to happen. I knew that's where you were headed all along, and you had no idea, and you were over here worrying about this real little thing, and boy, did you not know what you needed to worry about yet. I think there's a strong sense of his sovereignty in it. That is stabilizing for me to say, as I mentioned earlier, even Hannah, you are going to teach ESL for several years because I've got a plan for you. And so for me, it is a gentleness, but it's also this kind of, I don't know, this overarching storyteller who's already written the story. And he's just taking me through the twists and turns. And he knows when the joke's coming. And he knows when the difficult, scary chapter is coming. And because he already has the knowledge, he's there to act as a guide, but he also gets to have some of the inside jokes too.
Well, let's see. I always like to ask my guests about books they would recommend. I'm assuming because you are a writer, you're also a reader. So what do you have to share with us that maybe we haven't heard of yet?
Well, I think I actually read more probably before I started writing, which is terrible.
Well,
now I find myself reading more within the genres that I write in. I read for projects or I read for articles. I do very much still enjoy fiction, and I've got some favorite go-to authors that when I'm stressed out and I just need to relax. I'm a big fan of Alexander McCall Smith, P.G. Wodehouse, just those lighter fiction writers. But a book that I read recently that I did actually read in context of my work, but ended up affecting me very profoundly in ways that I did not expect. I thought it was going to be read this for your work, is a book that hasn't even released yet. I believe it's releasing early next year, and it's a book called Dangerous Territory by Amy Peterson. It's a memoir, and Amy is writing about her time in Southeast Asia as an ESL teacher right after she got out of college. And it's about how naive we are when we go into our dreams, what we believe are our God-given dreams, and the level of self-reliance that we enter those dreams with. And for Amy in particular, it was a dream of travel and mission work and what it would mean to be working for God's kingdom in this way. And it's really a beautiful process that she takes you through, from moving from being committed to God, being committed to the dream, to surrendered to God. And the way she describes that is commitment is more about what you're bringing to God, and you're the side of the coin where you're saying, I'm going to do this for you, God. Moving to a place of surrender where you're becoming reliant on God to do the work, and saying, I'm really surrendered to whatever that dream is. I thought it looked like this, and I thought it meant this, and I was committed to that. But now I'm moving to a place of surrender to whatever you're doing. So that's called Dangerous Territory. And again, it doesn't release till next year, I believe, but definitely one to snag when it comes out.
So I have to ask, how have you read it? Did you get like an advance copy?
It was
Okay.
It was an advance copy for review and endorsement. So
Awesome. Very cool. Well, that sounds like a perfect book to recommend to our listeners. So thanks for sharing that. And then I think the last thing I wanted to ask you is just what you have a gift to offer as well.
Yes. I want to both say thank you to you, Merritt, but also to the listeners. Being able to come on and talk about the work that God is doing in my life, to talk about the process He's taken me through in my writing, is such a gift and an opportunity that I want to also say thank you for people to listen along. So what I would like to offer your readers is the opportunity to get a set of my books, a copy of Made for More and Humble Roots. And we'll set up something. I guess you can set up something on the site. So we'll allow listeners to enter to win that.
Awesome. So 2 books, Made for More and Humble Roots, by Hannah Anderson herself. I'll put all the details about that in the show notes, as well as, Hannah, what's the best place if people want to connect with you? Where are you online most active?
Well, I probably am most active on Twitter, and my handle there is @sometimesalight. I do have a blog, and that is www.sometimesalight.com. That's all one word. There's a lot of back articles and writings there. I probably post maybe once a month there, but there's a lot of archived content. And I'm also on Facebook I have an author page under Hannah Anderson.
Thanks for listening to this repeat episode of the Devoted Dreamers podcast. I'm doing this all summer long, resharing some of my favorites that you might have missed, but I will be back with new episodes in September. Until then, come find me in my Devoted Dreamers Insiders group on Facebook, and don't forget to grab those journaling questions at my website, merrittansa.com/store, to help you process what you've heard here today. Thank you again so much for joining me. And wherever you are with your God-shaped dreams, may you have the courage to take one step toward their realization today.